Hello, welcome everyone. So today is June 12th, and in our member favorites session here, our topic is going back to the December 2018 issue. So it's been about 2.5 years since it came out, but it was a theme issue on addiction. There are 5 articles. I wish we could cover them all, but they're all kind of related on the same theme. We're featuring 2 of the authors of 2 of the articles. The other 3 authors couldn't be with us today, but we're going to pick these 2, which I think were some of the lead articles that came in. And we're delighted to have Judy Toronchuk and Janet Warren here to talk about their articles. And maybe some of you have had a chance to read these in advance. And so, as is our custom here, I'd like to take a few minutes of introducing each of them and having them tell us a little bit more about themselves. And then we're going to move into an open discussion. We'll talk about the articles a little bit, and then Vicki will turn on the microphones, and then you'll be able to unmute yourselves and ask your questions directly. The simple rule is, if when I call on you and it's your turn, please unmute yourself to ask your question, and after you're finished, please mute yourself again so that we don't have the background noise going on. So, Judy and Janet, first of all, Judy Toronchuk, pleased to have you on the program. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, and I understand that both of you 2 are Canadians. At least you're connected with the CSCA. Judy, were you born and raised in Canada?
No, I was born and raised in New Jersey.
Oh, my goodness. How'd you get north from New Jersey?
Well, that's a long story. I went to Rutgers University as an undergrad, majored in biology, and that's where I learned about ASA. I went to some ASA meetings even as an undergraduate. And then I went to Canada, to Mcgill University for my master's in zoology, and just sort of stayed on, and well, mostly in Canada since that time. I did a master's in zoology, and then at McGill, and then a PhD in physiological psychology at McGill. And then right after that, I went to Germany and worked at the Max Planck Institute for Psychiatry in Munich.
Oh, really? Oh, that's terrific. Yeah.
And also at the University of Munich. And then I came back to Canada, but that time to British Columbia, and did research at UBC, taught a little bit at UBC, and then moved to Trinity Western University, where I taught for 20 some years, depending on how you count it, part-time or full-time.
Right, yeah.
Years. And then as a retirement project, I did a master's in theology at Regent College.
That was while you were teaching at Trinity Western?
No, after
before that.
I retired.
Oh, afterwards. Okay. Yep. Oh, that's good. So what attracted you to McGill? I mean, all the way from New Jersey.
I actually was married to someone who had...
I figured there was some connection there.
A position at McGill in zoology, but it turned out to be a very good decision. It was an excellent department, and both in zoology and in physiological psychology. Of course, Donald Hebb and Peter Milner and Ron Melzak, a number of really important people were in that department. Okay,
that's great. It's very good. So you pursued it ever since. That is super. We'll talk about your article in just a minute, but let's talk a little bit with Janet. Janet, you're also actually you're president of the CSCA now, aren't you?
No, past president. Patrick is
president. Okay, I can't keep up with the rapid changes here. I'm just reading from the journal. Okay, so that
I was in 2018.
You were back then. Okay, that's good. Well, were you born and raised in Canada? Are you a native Canadian?
Well, everybody wants to know about my mixed up accent. So I was actually born in South Africa, and I lived there just long enough for the neural language pathways to be set. So I have that little bit of an accent. I been in Canada most of my life, though.
Okay.
It's a mix.
So
As I like to tell people, good thing my identity is in Christ.
That's right. So how'd you get from South Africa to Canada? Why didn't you just stay in South Africa?
On an airplane.
Yeah, you know what I mean. Yeah.
My family decided to immigrate for political reasons.
Ah, I see. Okay.
And we were actually also in Montreal initially.
Mm-hmm. And so where did you go to school?
So I did my BSc in psychology right here, actually in Hamilton, Ontario, where I am now. Then I did medical school at University of Toronto. And then I did my 14-year master's in theology at Tyndale. And then I did my PhD in theology at the University of Birmingham in the UK. Okay,
that's great. Well, really appreciate your being here. So let's turn a little bit more to this topic of addiction. Can you first kind of tell us a little bit about how this theme issue came to be? Who sponsored this? Maybe I should ask Jim here, but how did you get interested? How did the theme issue come about? How did you get started on writing these articles? Judy, why don't you start?
Yeah, as I was the editor of that issue, but I took that job on because Jim Peterson asked me to do so. So I had already published a couple of papers, review papers or theoretical papers on motivational and emotional systems in the brain as a neuroscientist. And so it wasn't that far removed from the idea of addiction, motivational systems.
Okay. And Janet, they roped you in at some point?
I think I volunteered when I saw the invitation for it. And I'm sort of all over the map because I practice psychotherapy as a family physician. So I have dealt with addictions, but, I wouldn't say it's been a major interest of mine. It's so common, you can't help but deal with it as a physician. But my interest actually initially came from my theological studies, and particularly, I did my dissertation on demonology and deliverance. And of course, that intertwines with the topic of sin. So then I had done more work on sin. And I had realized, and particularly the concept of existential sin and just the complexities. And I had realized, from my clinical experience with addiction, as well as some reading, and then the theological interest in the topic of sin, how the two intertwined and could be mutually informative.
Right, that's great. Okay, you really have a number of very impressive articles here. Really appreciate it. So let's dig into the content a little bit more before we open it up for the audience discussion. First of all, could each of you comment a little bit on just what addiction is? For example, how would you distinguish between addiction and a habit? Is there a continuum here that we're talking about? Because it seems that we use the term addiction so freely nowadays, and we talk about everything being an addiction. And so what really is there a little bit more of a precise definition of addiction? Judy?
There seems to be quite a number of theories that are floating around through the scientific community. Theories that it's a brain disease, theories that it's a habit, addiction is a habit versus a brain disease. Other past theories have more so stressed that addiction is a failure of the will. And that led to my title of my paper, trying to stress that this is probably a multifactorial disorder. Addiction involves both brain changes due to genetics, due to neurotransmitters, due to changes in synaptic pathways, which run, as it were, furrows in our brains, which then lead to habits. So, yes, it is a habit. but in a complex way. And there are other mitigating factors or facilitating factors such as trauma, particularly childhood trauma, and boredom, which comes up now in isolation, the great increase in overdoses. Francis Collins stated that there's a 42% increase in overdoses in 2020 as opposed to 2019. And a lot of that is boredom.
Interesting. Yeah.
But also stress. Yeah, stress and boredom. And then there's the sociological factors, which also feed into the COVID time. Isolation. Experiments have shown that even rats that are deprived of social relationships, which is most laboratory rats, that they are much more readily subject to addiction than rats which are able to live in a fancy Disneyland-like environment. So isolation, there's economic factors, disparity.
Well, you're getting a little bit more into the causes here, and I wanted to start a little bit more with how do you recognize an addiction? What really distinguishes an addiction from a repetitive behavior or something that you're doing a lot? Janet, you're more involved in the clinical aspects. How would you diagnose addiction as opposed to other behaviors?
Sure. And I mean, it's a very good question. And I think both Judy and I agree that it's on a continuum, and there's many different views on it. So I would actually disagree with a lot of the medical things that talk about it as being, a chronic brain disease, because I do think there's the sociological, psychological factors as well. So, I mean, the simple way to think about it is any sort of repetitive behavior that a person is compelled to persist in, regardless of any harmful effects on themselves and harmful effects on others. So that's sort of one of the ways is to look at the harmful effects, and the point also where the person feels that they don't have control over it. And it can be a really slippery slope. As you were saying, habits can form addictions and can develop into addictions. The underlying motivations is another way to help understand it. Some habits serve no purpose and don't interfere with your life, no big deal. But others, it's insidious. I think it's also helpful actually to distinguish between chemical or substance addictions and behavioral addictions. Again, there is overlap because some of the behavioral addictions can cause some of the same brain changes that the substances do. But when you get into substances, then you're adding that whole chemical interaction component that is a different aspect of dealing with. And can be more complex, basically.
Well, so all of this, both the diagnosis and some of these causes that you're talking about, Judy, it really means that the topic becomes very complex very quickly with so many parameters and so many different variations of it. So it's a little tough to get a handle on it. So, Judy, for example, you started talking about the different causes that you cited. And if I look at your article, if I just count the number of pages, you spend about 6 or 7 pages on the biological nature of addiction. And, I'm just a physicist, so these organic names, kind of go over my head. But then only 1 page each of the psychological, of the social, cultural environment, and then less than a page of kind of the spiritual aspect. Does that reflect in any way your assessment of the relative importance of these causes?
Not really. What it reflects is my background and training, which is in neuroscience and not in the more sociological aspects. And also that's what Jim Peterson asked me to do, was to talk about from my perspective as a neuroscientist who had already published in the area of motivation and emotion.
So do I understand from your article that kind of all these various factors that you discuss, they're kind of all there in addiction to one degree or another. Maybe each person has a little different mix of causes, but I got the impression from your article that all of these causes are kind of present to one degree or another. Is that fair?
I think so, yes. And of course, it's very different for different people. Some people will have changes in one neurotransmitter and not in others. And most people who become addicts have had childhood trauma. So that's a real factor. And we know that socioeconomic factors play a role as well. And yes, and now we know pandemics play a role too.
Yes, right. But Janet, if you're treating some of these on a clinical set, if you got such a spectrum of causes, you can't just address one of those, right? And how is it possible to do the whole spectrum?
So So first of all, sort of wanted to, I prefer the term predisposing factors maybe as opposed to causes, or because there's just so many multiple different ones. And even with the biochemical changes, it can be a chicken egg thing, right? We don't know if the biochemical changes come first to cause the behavior, or if the behavior can cause the biochemical changes. So, that's always an issue. But the whole idea of this continuum, and in some ways almost, I wouldn't want to quite say normalizing, but I really wanted to disabuse us of any notion of an us them. It's like, well, there's normal people and then there's addicts. It's this, huge thing. Now, some people definitely have more of the biological predisposition than others, and certainly the psychological predisposition. So a lot of, and in treating, in general, my psychotherapy approaches, I like to talk about the outside in and the inside out. So the outside in approach would be the practical things like don't hang out with friends who do drugs. Don't make it too difficult for yourself. Mindfulness, the behavioral things, but then. The inside out is helping people understand the roots, and that's why I prefer trauma counseling to a lot of CBT, other type things, because you're dealing with the root issues, and it usually has more lasting impact. So, as Judy was saying, I wouldn't say all, but majority of people with addiction problems, it's rooted in a way to ease the pain, and that's often how addictions start, at least substance addictions, and even other addictions. It's a way to alleviate pain, and then it spirals out of control. Right.
So I have one more question. Then we will open it up. And by the way, I see one already, but. Click on the reactions and then click on raise hand if you want to ask a question, and you'll get in line, and we'll give you a chance in sequence. But I have one more question for you, Janet, first, and Judy, you can comment also. I just wanted to say that I know a psychiatrist who told me that in his practice that it was harder to treat a Christian for mental illness, especially the behavioral kind of emotional issues, than a non-Christian. And the rationale, as I understand it, was that the spiritual component was so amplified in their view, and others, that it dominated and made it difficult to isolate and treat the other causes. Would you agree with that, or dispute that, or what's your view there?
So, I can see sometimes with Christians, again, depending on their background and their type of their flavor of Christianity, if you like, sometimes I do have to spend time getting rid of the baggage that accompanies the Christianity. But in most cases, I actually find it easier, because when we're dealing with that root, the trauma and people feeling unloved, well, when they can know a God who loves and accepts them and who can ease their pain, right? Makes it so much easier to work with them in overcoming the false ways of easing their pain. Right?
So you would say it can go both ways. It can help in some cases, and in some cases it can distract from the real issue.
Right. But I would say overall more help than hinder. The hinder would be more maybe at the beginning. Okay.
All right. Judy, any comment on that?
I was reminded last night as I was looking over Janet's article again that she commented that we all tend to be dishonest with ourselves. And I sometimes wonder if there's a tendency in some areas of Christianity to be dishonest with ourselves, about ourselves, because we've taken on this view that because we're Christians, everything's okay. We've been forgiven, so there isn't any more problem with sin. And so we kind of tuck to the side any problems that we may have. I have seen this in a number of areas of Christianity. But of course, it's not true of every possibility in Christianity. There is the emphasis on confessing our sins, and that should make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So, Vicki, if you want to enable people to unmute themselves, and you've already done that. So I see the first raised hand is from Charles Chaffee. Charles, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. These are very stimulating articles, both scholarly and sympathetic. But I'd just like to digress to remark that both of the authors have done wonderful service for the Canadian scientific and Christian affiliation over its half-century of existence. Judy Toronchuk was there at the conference, the first the ASA held in Canada in 1972, and has carried the banner of the CSCA in Western Canada during the early years when the only critical mass really was in Southern Ontario. And now there's great strength across the continent, thanks to the foundations laid in those times, while Janet Warren has served as president, but no remote figure. She was there on the ground in Hamilton, plugging in the kettle and making sure that the local meetings ran really well and were a blessing to those who attended. And so we really owe a debt of gratitude to our two authors, not only for their scholarship, but also for their service. But my question, I'd like to ask about external factors in addiction. In the news in Canada, at least, the opioid crisis has been linked to injuries in the construction industry, where the physical labor often overstrain or injury, and the workers are prescribed opioids, and this leads to an addiction. And so it's not only a brain question, but a body question. And then another sad area in Canada has been the plight of the indigenous people, like the Native Americans, the so-called Indians, who were forced to attend as children generations ago residential schools taken from their homes and forced to learn an alien language, namely English or French. And the upshot has been that these, we call them the survivors, are not properly functional as family people, and there are serious social problems which has caused addiction and alcoholism. And So
So
thinking about the thought of sin, it's the larger sin of the society as well as the sin of the actual addict. And are there ways you could see to alleviate these problems?
Okay. Janet, you want to go first?
Sure. So, I mean, you bring up a good point that I think applies to a lot of different topics, is this whole spectrum. So at the one end, you've got the biochemical type thing, then you've got more the psychological, and then you've got where, I work at the individual level in terms of counseling, but then of course you've got the whole societal level, and they all spiral around together and impacting each other. So you're absolutely right. Societal factors are important, and definitely not my area of expertise. One of the small, somewhat encouraging things I see is there's a lot more awareness these days than there used to be. Awareness is always a first step towards change. So awareness and some control over availability of substances, perhaps, but it is a long way to go, and I'm not sure I have any brilliant ideas.
Judy, any comment?
Thank you for those kind words, Charles.
Yes.
I don't have any particular new comments either, except that perhaps with the news in Canada of the appalling things that have happened in residential schools, it seems that there may be more of an emphasis now on helping Indigenous people and equality for Indigenous people. And certainly we know that both in Canada with Indigenous people and in the States with disadvantaged socioeconomic groups and ethnic groups, that there is a tremendous problem with addiction, and that this comes to much extent from the inequalities themselves. Deaths of despair is what some researchers have referred to these as.
I think this is an excellent point, Charles, because in a very powerful way, there's a sin of society, really, that triggers addictions and increases that. And it's one that we're probably too loath to acknowledge. And it is so difficult to change a society in terms of where it is. You might imagine, for example, the addiction to cigarettes, right? And of course, I remember when I started work, smoking was everywhere in the workplace, and many people became addicted to the nicotine, which is very hard to approach. But it was a societal factor. And I remember thinking, this will never change. You can never change this. Wow. In the 80s, it suddenly turned around. And I was shocked how our cultural change. So it can happen, but it's not easy to do. So you raise a very good issue that we need to pay attention to. Mark, you were next. Good to see you here. And I don't know if anyone else deciphered what's behind your head, but welcome here. I know you've been in China quite a bit.
The translation is below. It's faith, hope, and love. Hi, everyone.
All right. I love it. Oh, of course.
Yeah. I have a question for Judy, and thank you both for these great papers and for this opportunity. You talk about the development of the addiction as being these, exogenous sources of chemicals that create supraphasic, instantaneous happiness. And then it becomes eventually those neural ruts like you talked about. And then you said in comparison to the more tonic, natural, a nice meal with friends will do it, but it's slower and it's not as high. Can you talk at all about, kind of coming out of when you've had those supraphasic high and instantaneous doses of such quick release of, those hormones and such. And then when a person's trying to come out of that, what are things that can you can do to replace the easy, cheap, quick fix, but with such horrible long-term consequences with the slower, harder, gradual, but more sustainable approach? Thank you.
Yeah, I think one of the things that seems to be the most helpful is supportive social interaction with loving and caring other people. And that may be why 12-step programs are so effective. But also that would suggest that church families and small group fellowships and so on should be really effective in helping people overcome addictions. I was just reading the other day about another technique that counselors seem to be finding now to be helpful, and that is getting people to talk about future narratives involving future thinking, and in very detailed manner describing and picturing, imagining in their heads exactly what they would like to see happen in the future, or some happy situation in the future. And that this strengthens the prefrontal cortex and allows some of these ruts to be unrutted, to be filled in and ameliorated. So thinking it has to be in very specific terms about what you want to see in the future.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But I think social support is probably the most important thing, and the church ought to be able to provide that. We don't often, but we should.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think just that's part of what we're about here, about the whole reason Jim put this whole theme issue together, is that we as Christians, especially in the sciences, to have a much better awareness and understanding of the addiction issue so that we can have an effective interaction. And we're not the clinicians, we're not those, but the social support that we give from your articles seems to be very important. Okay, thank you very much, Aaron. It's good to see you back on the program. For those of you who weren't with us, Aaron was featured in our very first episode of Diving Deeper, and be sure to go back and hear her recording. She was excellent. So, Aaron, good to see you. Your turn.
Hi, thank you so much, Judy and Janet. Thank you for your excellent work and bringing these topics in for conversation. In some of your responses, I'm kind of getting this tension of the connection between biology and behavior. And it's really the impossibility of finding like this first cause, right, as the unicorn of trying to figure out what the reason for addictive behaviors are. I'm wondering, kind of in light of the fact that our behavior influences our biology and our biology influences our behavior, do you think that the term addiction is helpful beyond, I mean, maybe helpful in a clinical sense, but not in an everyday sense, maybe not helpful in a clinical sense? I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the utility of the phrase, given the implications for how it is perceived and used as labels and that. I will kind of leave it open-ended, and hopefully you can make something of what I'm hoping to hear about.
Sure, I'll take that. So I think Randy was saying earlier too about how it's used very glibly in society these days. Oh, I'm addicted to this, I'm addicted to this, and which I think anytime, so again, it's partly good there's awareness, but then it can trivialize people who have a serious addiction problem, right? We don't want to do that. I'm not sure if there's, a substitute term is not coming to mind very easily, but perhaps we could add a qualifier. So, and in fact, that's what the DSM has been doing, saying a substance use disorder, as opposed to saying again, I don't think labels are helpful, like calling someone an alcoholic, although I know that's sort of the AA model, which is, by the way, different from a Christian view, because a Christian perspective, we can change. We have salvation. We have redemption. We're not stuck with a label for life. Anyway, that's a little bit aside. So, staying away from those labels and focusing. So maybe rather than using the term addiction on its own, use it with a qualifier. I'm not sure if that would help. And like I was saying before, cocaine addiction or opioid addiction is quite different from when eating disorder is something else I treat quite often. And I think it fits well with an addiction type model. Cutting, self-harm is an addictive type behavior. It's used to relieve pain, but then it can become compulsive. The gambling, a whole lot of those things, they all have somewhat different, although the roots might be similar, they have different manifestations, different modes of treatment quite often. So I would think maybe just being more specific.
Okay. Judy, you want to try that one?
I was thinking as Erin was speaking that every behavior, every activity, everything that we think or do has a neural component, because it's two sides of the same thing, the inner and the outer. So we can't get away from the neurological and the neurophysiological components here.
And
the term addiction does seem to have been spread out so widely that, in a sense, it has lost a lot of its meaning. On the other hand, maybe that should remind us that we are all subject to these repetitive, compulsive kinds of behaviors, and maybe they don't become harmful, but here I am checking the news on the internet several times a day. Is that an addiction? Well, in some definitions, yes.
Mm-hmm. I think from a Christian perspective too, it's a lot about orientation, intention, mindset. So one of the things I counsel people, at every moment of every day, we have a choice to help ourselves or hurt ourselves. From a Christian perspective, we can turn towards God or we can turn away. Now, it's maybe not quite that black and white, what's happening when we're sleeping, for instance, but I think that's can help us to understand what's going on. Another perspective that I know, Erin, is your specialty too, is that whole automatic thinking versus mindful, intentional kind of thinking. And, without taking it too broadly, but one of the key things with addiction, and smoking particularly is one I commonly use, because people just have their pack and they don't even know how many they smoke because it's just automatic. And that's what can then become addictive. So without even telling them to cut back, as soon as you tell people to start counting, they will almost automatically decrease the amount because they are becoming aware and becoming intentional. And that brings me back to the whole what Christianity has known for hundreds of years, and the whole contemplative stream of Christianity that I think a lot of our current contemporary Western world has lost. That idea of spending time gazing at God, basically. Yeah. I'll be going on tangents soon, so I'll be quiet.
Can I add to that, Randy?
Yes, please.
I think that in the same way that addictions, repeated behaviors, repeatedly taking drugs, repeatedly checking the internet, all of this runs ruts in our brains. But in the same way that spiritual disciplines run ruts in our brains as well. And the more you practice prayer, the more you practice spiritual disciplines, the more you practice righteousness, the easier it becomes, and the more ingrained and the more we change. And, in a sense, we are participating with God, working out our salvation, because it's God which works within us.
Well, that's an example, Judy, where it seems to me that there's quite a difference between thinking of prayer being a habit of prayer versus being addicted to prayer. The two don't seem the same over there. But I would ask in this vein also, is there any value in categorizing addictions based on both the consequences or symptoms of stopping the behavior? Because clearly there are many medications, not just opioids, but many ordinary medications. And when you stop taking them, there are rather severe biological effects. And of course, nicotine, everyone's aware of the difficulty of stopping. So does it help a little bit to think about different kinds of addictions in terms of what are the consequences of stopping the behavior?
Yeah, I think so. But first, can I say that in response to your thing about your comment about prayer, that some people also talk about religious addictions, and we know that there are people who become involved in cults or in strange practices that involve religious practices that are tantamount to addictions. Yes, some writers have even accused Augustine of being along this variety, but I won't go that far.
Yeah.
But yes, of course, there are different consequences of stopping different types of substance abuse, and some substances lead to withdrawal. Alcohol, for example, there's consequences to stopping alcohol, going into withdrawal, and on the other hand, things like addiction doesn't have the same sort of withdrawal. Cannabis doesn't either. So it varies from one substance to another.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate the complexities. So there's been some comments in the chat about coffee and how some people can have a drink and it doesn't bother them. So remember there's that genetic biological predisposition, and there's actually a coffee gene in terms of the effects that it probably has another name, I'm sure, but so there's that. Randy, I'm not sure and then the other comment I wanted to make about the religion is not all addictive behavior is necessarily bad. It's the motivations, it's the consequences are sometimes only to the person involved in the behavior. And sometimes, we have the people at church who do everything, and they're wonderful. And it can be very difficult for them to understand that they're actually operating out of a need to please, for example, or a need for approval, as opposed to actually, doing God's work, etc. Mm-hmm. So it can be very, very subtle and complex. And as far as understanding addiction from the consequences, more so, I would say, with substance and chemical addictions rather than with behavioral addictions, because some can stop and the consequences are not necessarily there's not necessarily sort of withdrawal effects. So I don't think that would explain everything. It can help.
Right. All right. Ken, I see your hand, but we've got Larry asking a question first. All right. So you'll be after Larry. Larry, I see you here. What's your question? Larry, O'Toole, you gotta unmute yourself, please. Unmute. There you go.
Unmute.
Okay.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. It was good reading both your papers. I was especially interested in the concept of the dark night of the soul. Janet, you mentioned that. And you may have mentioned that too, Judith. I know you mentioned Augustine, I think, in your paper. But I wanted to share something first, and that is that I'm a clinical social worker, retired now. I still have my license, but I spent over 30 years treating addictions and as an executive. But I also, on a personal note, have going on 40 years of abstinence and recovery from alcohol addiction myself. And the key thing that I see to addiction is helping people find a pathway out of the addiction. We can go with the theories, of chemical imbalance, of spiritual malady, soul sickness, and everything else. But it's helping people find a way out. And AA is probably the most effective one. Well, AA or 12-step, others 12-step recovery programs. But the key to that is addressing the loss of spiritual values. That thing that everyone ends up kind of in that dark night of the soul, Augustine's dark night of the soul, where one cannot find one's one's way out. One is trapped. The addiction, in repeating the addictive behavior, with significant consequences to oneself and those around one. So it was. I found that. I found in my 30 years of providing treatment that the thing that kept people from recovery was the inability to accept God, or the idea of looking at a way of accepting a power greater than oneself. I think that was really key. There's kind of a spectrum that starts with kind of a mindfulness that works pretty good. And, it can include things like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, through mindfulness and then other kinds of religions. And I think with Christians, we have a really significant advantage in that we have a personal Savior in Jesus Christ. And it really did mean a lot to me. And I saw other people in 12-step recovery find that same solution. The people who were most successful were the ones that accepted Jesus Christ as their personal Savior, found their way to Christianity. But anyway, I just want to thank both of you for your papers, and I did want to share that. It's not always easy to share the personal, but and I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you very much for your comment, Larry. Judy or Janet, want to comment on that? No? Okay. Nothing more to add. That's.
So I guess one
Yeah. Go ahead.
Comment. I mean, addiction, some of the, particularly the substance like alcohol, is just so difficult to treat. And they talk about the hitting rock bottom. I've had, or they talk about, they'll get better once they hit rock bottom. I've had so many people who come to me, I've hit rock bottom, I'm ready, blah blah blah. We come up with a plan. I see them frequently the next week and the next week. Within 3 weeks, they're gone, and I know what's going on, and they don't come back, and I know why. So it's just, it's that quick fix too. And I think actually I wrote about that when I was writing about a Christian perspective on alternative medicine. I think for a lot of, even within Christianity, we're looking for that quick fix. I think is one of the reasons why people can be attracted to fundamentalist forms of Christianity, because it's so much easier to follow rules and follow black and white than to have this somewhat at times ambiguous, changing personal relationship with our Savior, where the things can change day by day. So it is often just the easier path, as well as being the well-worn one. But even those first. Even before it's well worn, for a lot of people, it's just the easy way out. Right.
Okay, so Ken Turian is next, and Joe. Yes, I saw your note there. We'll put you after Ken. Okay.
I have a very brief question. It hasn't been addressed. Is there a scientific or rational explanation of cold turkey quitting? I've had several people who had this complete. Almost overnight, they drop and never go back. Or any of them can answer to that. Is there an answer to that? Yeah.
I don't know that any scientific explanation is really necessary. I mean, we've already talked about how it's so variable and individual in terms of, first of all, whether someone gets addicted to something or not, and then, when and how they quit. There's no one size fits all. I was joking about with somebody, that sometimes, they talk about motivational interviewing, take your time, get the person. But for some people, they have their heart attack or whatever, and the surgeon or whoever says, "Oh, you've got to quit," and they quit. So there's strong motivation is a factor, but some people don't even have to have a heart attack to, or an illness or whatever it takes to quit. Some people can just do. So I would say it's just individual personality factors as to how some people can do it. It works for some people, not others.
And probably partly because different people have different combinations of neurotransmitters, transporters, enzymes, and so on, and slightly different brain pathways. And so that's going to make a big difference. And also the amount of trauma from childhood abuse and that sort of thing is going to be very, very variable.
By the way, does anyone know the origin of that idiom for going cold turkey? I mean, why is it cold and not hot? Why is it turkey and not chicken or something? I mean, how did that idiom come about?
That's a good question.
I don't know. Okay, at any rate, Joe, you're next. What's your question?
Well, cold turkey described the bumps that would raise on their skin when they were going through withdrawal.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, really? Interesting.
But my question was related to Ken's. 60 years ago, Wilkerson's approach to heroin addiction was cold turkey and spiritual and social with no chemical intervention whatsoever. And Wilkerson used to claim that 90% of the people who went through his approach stayed clean, whereas a majority of those with methadone maintenance treatments went back to street drugs soon after release. So I wanted to ask whether the medical literature has validated the kind of approach that was advocated by Teen Challenge and pioneered by Wilkerson.
Good one.
So I'm not familiar with that approach, but as I was saying before, no one size fits all. And the other thing I would also comment on is the self-selection bias. So it's possible that people who would choose a program like that were perhaps more motivated to do better.
I have often read that statistic that Joe mentioned from Wilkerson and read about his program in the early years, of course, growing up in New Jersey. But I haven't ever read any scientific validation of it, although it does seem that there's some scientific validation that social support, things like 12-step programs, be they Christian or not, are the most helpful things. So, but I don't know about the 90%.
Okay.
But that claim is in Wilkerson's book, The Cross and the Switchblade.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Really
I'm familiar with, yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. I read that. Janet, I've got a question for you in your article. You spent a lot of time talking there about addiction and sin, and you seem to stress that it's an analogy, that we can learn about sin from addiction and vice versa. Mm-hmm. But I was also wondering to what extent you felt that addiction is a sin, and the other way around is sin and addiction, as the Apostle Paul seems to describe.
So yes, maybe yes, possibly, definitely. I don't know. So it's complicated. So what I would want to avoid is viewing sin in any black and white manner. Okay, so I do not want people just to say, "Oh, that addict, well, it's just sinful." End of story. It's like, no, I would say yes, sin is part of it, but it's not the only factor. The sin, in fact, could be the sin of that person's parents who were abusive and led to that gaping need in the person that they fill with an addictive substance, for example. I think it was you alluded to the communal sin, societal sin, that we don't often talk about. And societal sin, and it takes on a life of its own. So yes, I think in many ways we could see addictive behavior as sinful, but also remember, as we were talking about, a lot of good behavior could be seen as sinful because of the motivations that underlie it. There can be so many different factors. So whenever there's, I was talking before about, our choice to turn towards God or turn away from him. Anytime turning away from God could be viewed as sinful. In fact, that's the way I like to define sin, not in terms of behavior, but in terms of orientation. So if we're turning, towards an object and idolizing it, yes, that's such as with substances or many addictive behaviors. Sure, that's idolatry, that's sinful. But all I want to say is what I really wanted to be clear about is there's more to it than that. So that's part of it. But having a biological predisposition, I don't think is sinful. Unless you want to view it if that's maybe communal, generational, collective, original type sin. By the way, I like to view original sin as having a 100% pretest probability. So in a way, it's like our genetic predisposition, right? We're all predisposed to sin, but we don't all choose particular sinful behaviors. And as we know, sin can even be in our attitudes and not our behaviors. So I don't think there's a straightforward yes or no answer to that. That it's just really about understanding the complexities of sin.
We are all predisposed to sin partly because we are raised by parents who, nice as they might be at times, are themselves sinful, and other caretakers, teachers, other people in the environment who are sinful. We are completely surrounded by a sinful society, so we cannot avoid the implications of sin.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
There's just a helpful comment in the chat box from Kenneth Carter. So yes, I would agree that there's not always a knowable connection between sin, I'm assuming, as being sort of behavior, and culpability. So that's one of the helpful pointers to think about in terms of moral culpability. So I think sometimes, though, the whole disease model goes too far and saying, oh, no culpability, you're just a helpless, innocent victim kind of thing. Or, this disease just happened to you out of nowhere. It's like, well, there's some choice along the way. So it's not clearly one or the other.
Right. Okay, Vicky, you have your hand up?
Yeah, hi everybody. It's great to see you all. And Janet and Judy, thank you so much. As we mentioned earlier, this is a topic that affects all of us, either personally or through family, friends, neighbors, people in our church. And so I appreciate you being here today. I also appreciate Larry's vulnerability and sharing his thoughts. That can be hard. And I thank you for doing that, Larry. I attended a Trinity Forum webinar yesterday put on by Andy and Amy Crouch on their latest book, My Tech-Wise Life, and I understand it's being reviewed in the journal, which is great. But Andy and Amy talked a lot about technology and the addiction to technology and the approach that they take in terms of spiritual discipline. So I was interested in what you had to say, Judy, about the spiritual discipline aspect of addiction. And one of the things that they talked about was this concept of Sabbath delight and taking a day of rest from work and technology, and their core commitment of living apart from the screens. And let's face it, all of us deal with this, whether it's through our children or even ourselves in terms of the addiction to our cell phones or devices, gaming, checking our emails, or even social media, workaholism. So I'm just curious, both of you, what your thoughts are And have you done much study on the addiction to technology?
I don't know about specifically technology, but I know that there are studies on video gaming, which is a form of technology, of course, but the same areas of the brain are involved, and neuroimaging shows that the same areas of the brain are involved, and the same release of dopamine seems to be involved as in other addictions. So it is very similar physiologically.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I would say, same sort of concepts that you would use to treat as with any other behavioral addictions. Look at understanding the mindfulness. Do I need to do this? Why am I doing this? Is this going to glorify God or not? All sorts of questions we can ask ourselves that can sort of be a test. And then, of course, not only the individual level, but the societal level is a big factor, because, when you're with a group of people and they're all using a certain technology, it can be very difficult to be the one who's not using that technology.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of hopeless chatter happening, so I wanted to put some hope back in the conversation. I do find myself in doing counseling, I often have a bit of a skewed perspective, because I do see the most difficult cases, but there are a lot of people that recover from addiction with no therapy. And, a lot of people, in fact, a Christian point of view, I remember as a young Christian listening to these salvation stories about people who were addicts, etc. And they had Damascus Road experience and completely healed, and their lives changed. And I remember being slightly jealous of their stories, when mine was more, intellectual surrender type conversion story. So yeah, there's a lot of hope, even on the practical level. A majority of addictions majority of people do recover from addictions. So we have to sort of step back and get that perspective. We're talking about how broad it is and difficult to treat. And then, the other hope of, so going back to the salvation stories, I think quite often people who have had addiction problems, serious ones, are much more willing to admit that they have a problem. And that's the whole, the AA premise. I can't do this alone. I need help. And that's so difficult for so many people to admit. So in many ways, people with problems or the serious problems are more open to hearing the gospel than other people. So, that's one angle of hope to look at. And then the other that I was talking about earlier is in terms of counseling people. And working with Christians I find very encouraging, because they've got that faith that can be I don't mean to use faith in a utilitarian manner, but, it can be their substitute for their addiction in a way. Obviously, it's much more than that. And even non-Christians are always open to, talking about spiritual issues. And I encourage people to explore their spirituality. So yes, there is a lot of hope.
Judy?
Yeah, the statistics are that the majority of people do recover from addiction. And interestingly, of all the addictions, smoking, nicotine addiction is the one that takes the longest towards recovery, whether that's because people don't see it as being as disruptive to their lives, and so they aren't as motivated to quit or not, I'm not sure, but it is the one that takes the longest time to lose.
And I want to harken back to someone who asked, was it Charles? Someone talked about external factors that trigger addictions in our society. And I think this is one thing I'm taking away here is that there's more hope for recovery here if we collectively, as a Christian community, recognize the need for us to think as a society, think as a social group for collective action so that we select those behaviors that minimize addiction or avoid the kind of social structures. And yes, we could point fingers at all those awful doctors who overprescribed opioids, but that's only one small part of it. There are many other factors, and I think if we can really concentrate and think about our collective behaviors that influence that, I think that can be a very powerful element of hope in this whole issue. Mm-hmm. All right, I don't see any more raised hands. Oh, Ken has got another one. Ken, go ahead.
One more question. Is it true that addiction to pornography, especially among Christian leaders we hear about, is the most difficult one to deal with? Male people, men like myself, I'm not, it's actually, it was like a disease with men, pornography, and they just can't get out of it. Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't know that we could call anything the most difficult. It can all be difficult, but absolutely an excellent example of addiction in Christian circles among Christian leaders. It is high statistics, and I think part of the problem it's one of those sort of easily secret addictions, because it's not something where people can see somebody, like with alcohol, drugs, you can see somebody being intoxicated, you can see withdrawal effects. And then, of course, when we talk about societal factors, there's the accessibility factor as well, especially with the internet. It's all free and easily accessible. And there's, little motivation to stop. There's little understanding of the harms it is. And I would love to see more pastors preach about healthy sexuality in general. And then, addiction. And I think that's a societal issue, is that we've had so little teaching on what healthy sexuality is, and particularly in our churches.
There's a good book on this by Struthers. I think it's Bill Struthers, who used to be, maybe he still is, a member of ASA, and he's written about addiction to pornography among Christians.
Okay. Yeah, that's one we hadn't really mentioned here before. And there's those addictions that are private and personal, and others are more publicly visible. So it's really an incredible range of addictions, and it's important to have these discussions out in the open. Mm-hmm. Any other comments from everyone? I think Dave Singer, you have your hand up. You got to unmute yourself. Yeah, unmute. Yeah, you need to unmute. We can't hear you otherwise. Oh.
There we go.
Okay.
All right. Yes, I was fascinated with Janet's correlation between angst, fear, and sin, and how we are all, how that makes it a universal challenge. I'd just like to hear her talk about that some.
Existential philosophy, Søren Kierkegaard was one of the first to come up with this idea of existential angst, and the idea that that we're all born into a situation where we have this sort of crisis of being in a way, I like the simple summation of okay, there is a God and it's not me. So that automatically creates this tension, and that, we have to work out our salvation with fear and trembling our entire lives and coming to terms with that. But that's one of the things, having that, angst of being human, having that tension between our limitations, being within a human body, but having the capacity to transcend our bodies, and really only, as far as we know, only humans have this, which is why only humans are morally accountable, et cetera, et cetera. And even people who don't acknowledge that there is a God, they still have that sense in them. They just choose to approach it in different ways. So we all have the sense of something bigger than ourselves that we can't quite grasp. And so that, creates this, on a psychological level, creates this susceptibility towards anxiety and tension, angst, which then, of course, is because we don't like feeling anxious, we want to get rid of it. And that's why people choose many different ways, addiction being a common one, to reduce that anxiety.
Okay.
And as I was saying before, is why we look for the quick fixes. It's why, I think as Christians, we're meant to live with some degree of discomfort. We're meant to live with some degree of, the John of the Cross, dark night of the soul. Augustine's famous saying, our hearts are restless till we rest in thee. But it's meant to be this tension. And that's where, spiritual disciplines, spiritual practices come in, because they can help us live with the tension in ways that are not addictive and not harmful.
And that's where spiritual growth enters in as well.
Mm-hmm.
And if we didn't have that tension, we probably would not grow.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been even shown in psychological studies, even without the spirituality, that people actually function better with some degree of tension. If it's too much, they don't function, but if it's too little, they don't function well. There's this happy medium.
Right.
That leads me to think of Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Right.
We are all searching for meaning.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. I don't see any more raised hands. And so, Judy and Janet, I'd like to give you each a chance for a closing comment, if you wish. Mm-hmm.
Mark has asked that we have a closing comment of hope. And I think that's very appropriate. Thanks, Mark. We do have hope in our Savior. And we know that although we walk through this valley of tears, we walk through these difficult times, we have a hope in Jesus, and we have this promise of salvation. We have this promise of being changed by Christ, being changed by God into his likeness.
And we have the indwelling Holy Spirit,
yes,
who guides us in all truth and comforts us in all our troubles.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I would like to thank both of you and the other authors of the other articles. And if some of you haven't read the other articles, they're also worth checking out at the December 2018 issue. The recording of this program will be available. Vicki just put the URL on the chat line. You can look at that. The chat line will also be included in the video, so you can see that. So again, thank you very much, Judy, Janet, and we hope to see all of you next month on July 10th.
And thank you, Randy, and everybody, for this opportunity to discuss this important topic.
You're most welcome. All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Hi, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for being here.